There are spirits, both good and evil, imprisoned in our world, held here by supernatural forces outside our control, forces so strong they shape entire histories and destroy uncountable souls. Through careful study and understanding, we can only hope that we will not be one of the latter. Ronald Harper, Paranormal Investigator. There are many mysterious places throughout the world with a distinct history of the strange and bizarre. They can be identified by the inordinate number of suicides, murders, accidental and natural deaths, and strange coincidences that have taken place there. The dead are said to mingle with the living on these sites in the form of ghostly apparitions. Buildings, empty lots, and forested areas are haunted by spirits who are angry, confused, or lost. There is a definite feeling that a force of some kind is manipulating events, often for the worse. One such place is the community of Inglewood in Calgary, Alberta. This quaint neighborhood has been at the mercy of a force that, until recently, has caused it nothing but pain and misery. Ground zero for this phenomenon is here, a refurbished 100-year-old 3-story colonial-style building named the Deane House. The external areas the force in the Deane House has drawn its spiritual energy from have been the result of suicides, murders, natural and accidental deaths, and heavy grief and suffering. This has caused the Inglewood community to become haunted by the apparitions of the dead and to have a very strange history of coincidences that feed a bad luck reputation that has been attached to it. What exactly is the entity in the Deane House, and where did it come from? It inhabits the building itself, but existed well before the residence was constructed. Nobody knows for sure how something such as this was created, but the general consensus is that it grew from the energy that existed in and around the area it now inhabits. The origin of this area can be traced back to here, the initial site of Old Fort Calgary, directly across the Elbow River from the present site of the Deane House. The history of the mysterious energy in the Deane House parallels the history of the Inglewood neighborhood. Through good times and bad, something has been guiding and influencing historical events here. We can trace a start to these events by understanding what happened when the first Aboriginal peoples on what is now the present-day Fort Calgary site met the first white man. A clash of cultures, fueled by rot-gut whiskey from American traders, formed an anger that spread across the area, enveloping the spiritual energy that already existed there. It appears that whatever is in the Deane House now was born from this. The first recorded description of the effect of this newborn force comes from Cecil Denny, second in command of F Troop, the mounted police regiment that arrived at the confluence of the Bow and Elbow rivers in 1875 and built Fort Calgary.
They, the traders, have been attacked by Blackfeet. Their horses ran off, and one of their number killed, and several wounded. The Indians sacked the stores and burnt them to the ground.
There is a report of a Blackfoot Indian who died during the confrontation. For many years afterward, the site of the tragedy in the northeast corner of the Fort Calgary site was said to be haunted by the angry spirit of the dead Aboriginal. He had refused to go on after his death and stubbornly stayed in the area to ward off anyone he came into contact with. Visions of a tall, pigtailed Indian in a leather loincloth were said to have taken place, along with the sensation of an uneasy chill in the air. Cold was the operative word as incredible harshness overcame the men building the original Fort Calgary. Temperatures went down to minus 40 degrees Celsius. George King, the first mounted policeman to walk on the site, described the conditions the men experienced as they constructed the fortification.
The weather was so severe the men could not stand it to remain outside and work for more than an hour at a time. Then they would go inside to get warm, and in this way the work went on. The men working an hour in the cold and then remaining inside for 2 hours to thaw out.
Conditions became so intolerable that the men of F Troop mutinied against their commander, Ephraim Brisbois, and he was forced to retire. A scraggly village of tents and shacks grew up east across the Elbow River from the original Fort Calgary site. This was the beginning of the community of Inglewood, and it was naturally assumed this was going to be the center of activity as the town of Calgary grew. When the Canadian Pacific Railroad arrived in 1883, they set up their station on the west side of the Elbow River and started selling lots around its station land in February 1884. Inglewood was left all but abandoned when most of its inhabitants moved their residences on skids across the frozen river and to the new town site. This sudden exodus was the start of a long, slow social and economic decline for Inglewood. It was also the continuation of the strange and bizarre events that started on the Fort Calgary site. Chief amongst these involved Calgary pioneer Alfred Ernest Cross. The Cross House, currently the Rouge Restaurant, was acquired by A.E. Cross, creator of the Calgary Brewing and Malting Company and one of the original founders of the yearly celebrated Calgary Stampede. Although a home of happiness for A.E., his wife Helen, and their children, the building also saw tragedy. On September 19, 1904, two of the Cross children, 4-year-old Helen, named after her mother, and 3-year-old Selkirk, died of diphtheria within hours of one another. As Helen Sr. descended the front staircase of the residence with Helen Jr. in her arms, intending to give her to A.E. and get her to a hospital, the child passed away. Selkirk died in an upstairs room a few hours later. A.E. died in a Montreal hospital at the age of 70 in March of 1932. His body was returned to Calgary and buried in Union Cemetery. Helen joined him 27 years later when she died of natural causes in the house at the age of 80 in February of 1959. The house remained in the Cross family's possession until it was given to the city of Calgary in 1977. It has become intimately connected with the entity in the Deane house in that the spirits of Helen Jr., Selkirk, Helen Sr., and A.E. Cross himself have been kept in the house by the phenomenon. The specter of A.E. Cross has been seen in various parts of the house, but most often in a large room on the main floor. He sits at a table near a huge picture window that looks out on the garden and grounds to the west. Helen Cross is often seen walking the large room and looking out the picture window. Witnesses have told of watching chairs move and the contents of tables rearranged. One particular chair always ends up by a window that looks out to the east of the house. This is the spot Helen Cross would take up to watch and wait for her husband as he came home from work each night. No known photos of Helen's ghost have ever been recorded inside this room. Outside is another story. Although locked and unoccupied at the time, 2 photos, taken 60 seconds apart from the sidewalk below the window of the upstairs bedroom dining area in the house, clearly show someone, or something, standing behind the glass. Analysis of the photographs show that the first one is of a woman with an early 20th century country dress and hairstyle, Helen Cross. In the second photo, the woman has mysteriously changed into a hideous gargoyle. These 2 pictures strangely echo a story from 1965 wherein a man claims to have seen a beautiful woman standing in the window. When she noticed him staring at her, she changed into a skeletal form. The man ran away, terrified, and never came near the house again. It would appear Helen Cross's ghost enjoys scaring observers off when she knows she's being watched. The spirits of Helen Jr. and Selkirk have been seen running throughout the house, spilling jars of their contents, rattling cutlery, and sometimes even being heard laughing while they played. The most startling tale of spirits coming from the Cross House concerns Richard Prod. Prod was a taxicab driver in 1967 when he picked up a fare outside the York Hotel in downtown Calgary on a cold spring night.
Man came out of the hotel. He was dressed all in black, even a black cowboy hat. He hopped in and never said a word.
The stranger pointed to where he wanted to go, and Prod somehow knew where to take him. When they reached the large white house in Inglewood, the stranger paid him his fare of $1.50 and got out of the cab. The last Prod saw of the man in black was as he was going through a gate near the building's front door. He glanced down as he was putting his money away, and when he looked back up, the stranger was gone. He didn't think anything of it until he tallied up his money at the end of the night and discovered he was $1.50 short. Not being able to do anything about it, he let the incident go. It wouldn't be until summer that Prod would figure out what happened that spring night. While at the Horsemen's Hall of Fame during the Calgary Stampede, he saw pictures of the founders of the rodeo. Chief amongst them was the person he swears he drove home 2 months earlier, Alfred Ernest Cross. The only problem was, Mr. Cross had died March 10th, 1932. 35 years before the cab ride.
Even at the time when I saw the guy, he looked too clean, too perfect. His skin was just too perfect. He looked like someone had cleaned him up for television.
It was then that Richard Prod realized the $1.50 he was missing the night he gave the stranger a ride home had come from a ghost. The spirits of once living people are not the only apparitions the phenomenon in the Deane house has trapped in Inglewood. Here at the Hose and Hound pub, formerly Fire Hall No. 3, a ghostly monkey and horse, long dead, still roam the building. The stomping of horses' hooves can be heard in the area where a magnificent white Percheron horse perished during a fire in the building in the 1920s. Like the Deane and Cross houses, cutlery, napkins fly off of tables and shelves. A dishwashing machine spews hot water from an open gate. The explanation? A pet monkey named Barney. Barney is the spirit that causes the most problems at the pub. Officially, he was killed by a stray dog as he was tied up outside the building in 1908. Unofficially, he savagely scratched a small boy who attempted to feed him as he was tied up outside the building. He was immediately put down and buried on the west grounds, where he roams today, when not wreaking havoc inside the pub. mysterious energy affecting events in and around the Fort Calgary area came to reside in a house built for the superintendent of the barracks, Richard Burton Deane. Right from the start, fortune did not favor this residence. Prisoners from the guardhouse excavated the basement, and the aggressive Deane made sure every board and window was put in according to his demanding specification. Before the house was completed, Deane's first wife, Martha, died. Except for a few servants, he was alone in the stately three-story house until he married his second wife, Mary. Tragedy struck again when Mary died of pneumonia in 1914. Deane retired after Mary's death and left Canada and his life in the mounted police behind. In 1914, the Grand Trunk Railroad bought the Fort Calgary site and tore down all the buildings. The Deane house, however, was saved. It was moved to the southeast part of the rail yards and used as a station master's residence. It was the Grand Trunk's bad luck to keep the house because the company went bankrupt and was bought by the Canadian National Railroad in 1919. From this time until 1929, the CNR used the house as a station master's residence. In 1920, a man died after being pushed down a flight of stairs in the house, and his spirit has been seen ever since. This is the first documented, although unverified, report of a spirit in the house. It will remain unverified because it is not true. This is one of a few mythic stories surrounding the Deane house. Truth is that this story was taken from a real incident that happened not in the house, but on the northeastern end of the CNR site 9 years later. On July 27, 1929, 18-year-old Frank Spencer fell from a CNR train near the freight yards while attempting to climb onto a train. He was dragged approximately 50 feet and died after being thrown clear of it. Having ridden the trains before, it is peculiar he should have met his end this way. The ghost of Frank Spencer has been seen laying in the area where he died. While taking a shortcut home through the rail yards one night in 1932, 3 men heard a horrible scream. A battered and bloodied body was seen on the ground a few yards in front of them. When the 3 walked up to the figure, it promptly disappeared. The witnesses fled the area and told nobody for almost 20 years. It was only during the Korean conflict, when the body of one of them was brought back to Calgary for burial, that the surviving 2 reminisced about the past, and the story came up. The Deane house was bought by C.L. Jakes in 1929 and moved across the Elbow River to its present site. From 1929 until the house was bought by the city of Calgary in 1972, that it earned its reputation as the most evil house in the city. An inordinate number of deaths and suicides occurred during this time. Many of these incidences are unverifiable, but a few persist. The ghosts of their victims have been seen. On this railing in the attic, in 1933, a 14-year-old boy, mercilessly teased by other children because of his epilepsy, hung himself. His spirit has been seen more than once, dangling a rope around his neck. Once again, another unverifiable story. Like the Frank Spencer incident, however, this tale resembles the true story of one John Gornyuk. On September 1st, 1928, John Gornyuk, a 35-year-old Romanian, wandered the banks of the Bow River close to the Canadian National Freight Yards, eerily near the spot where Frank Spencer would die a year later. He was despondent over not being able to get any work. The next morning, Robert Hunter, an on-site inspector for the CNR, found Gornyuk's dead body swinging from the limb of a tree. Gornyuk had hung himself by climbing into the tree, fastening a picket chain around his neck and letting himself fall. His motionless body was turned towards the freight yards. The Gornyuk ghost has been seen several times, always described as a motionless figure hanging from a ghost tree limb, floating in midair near the conflux of the Bow and Elbow rivers. In 1945, Jake sold the house to Alphonse Gowen and Roseanne Brotherton, and it became the Gaspé Lodge. Modifications were done and the house effectively became a tomb when the veranda on the west side was torn down to make way for a road leading to a garage behind the building, and the veranda on the south side was enclosed in order to make extra rooms. That same year, on February 14th, Rose died. Spooked by what he felt was an evil presence in the house, Gowen sold his share of it to Rose's estate, and the sole ownership of the building fell to her husband, Alex. In 1952, another suicide apparently took place in the house. It was supposedly the result of an unattainable love interest and happened on Valentine's Day. A woman threw herself out of a third-story window when she discovered her boyfriend had run off. Occasionally, this woman can be seen wandering the attic of the house in a white, flowing dress. In 1964, Alphina Cunningham, Alex Brotherton's daughter, died in her room in the house after a lengthy illness. This room is currently a part of the front veranda. Alphina's ghost is sometimes seen walking around the area and gazing out towards the front yard, waiting for someone who will never show up. In 1966, Alex Brotherton died of natural causes in a room that is now used as a bar area. His spirit is sometimes seen sitting in a chair, puffing on a cigar and listening to a ghost radio. He is buried next to his wife Rose, but eerily, there is no date of death for him on the tombstone. It wasn't until the house was refurbished and opened as an educational center and tea room in 1986 that the stories of ghosts in the residence started to come forth. Alex Brotherton was seen sitting in the parlor, the smoke from the cigar he was enjoying wafting in the air. Alphina was watched as she wandered the veranda. There was even an encounter with the apparition of an Aboriginal man. The specter of the Aboriginal man has been seen many times in the basement of the Deane house. From descriptions of him, he is most probably the Blackfoot who was killed during the confrontation at the American Whiskey Fort on the old Fort Calgary site in 1875. When windows started smashing and unconnected phones started ringing in the house, it soon got to be too much for the employees. Psychic Norma Cowie was brought in to get rid of the spirits. What she didn't reckon on, however, was the Vortex. When Norma performed her exorcism on the spirits in the house in 1991, the energy engulfing them was stubborn, but it let several of them leave. The spirits of Alex Brotherton, Alphina, and Roderick Umperville seem to be all that are left. A mysterious connection involving the presence in the Deane house and the Cross house allows visitors to feel the entity today and see the similarities in ghosts. On the second floors of each house is a large room. In the Deane house, this area is inhabited by the Vortex. In the Cross house, the ghost of Helen Cross is kept prisoner there. If you sit quietly in the Cross house room and concentrate on the ambience of it, you will soon feel a presence. This is the entity that keeps Helen Cross trapped in the second floor room, gazing out a window, waiting for her husband to come home. It retains AE in the main floor room, looking out a large picture window, and lets the Cross children, Helen Jr. and Selkirk, run about everywhere. If you sit quietly in the main room on the second floor of the Deane house and concentrate on the ambience there, you will soon feel the same presence felt in the Cross house. It retains Alex Brotherton sitting at a table in his main floor room, smoking a cigar, keeps Alphina Brotherton trapped in the main floor veranda room, gazing out a window, waiting for a mysterious stranger to come home, and lets the ghost of Roderick Umperville roam the basement. For some strange reason, the presence in the Deane house has extended its influence to the Cross house. No one has ever been able to explain why. While the Deane house and its history became entangled with the Vortex, the rest of the community of Inglewood was also affected. The first of two incidences linking the neighborhood with incredible historical events took place here in 1912. That year, the present McGill block was called the Dick Building. It was built by Albert A. Dick, one of Calgary's more prominent real estate investors. Albert and his new wife Vera had the bad luck to choose the most luxurious ocean liner of the time to return to Canada after a European honeymoon. The liner? The Titanic. As the ship sank, Albert and Vera were among the last of the first-class passengers to be put into half-filled lifeboats. The unnecessary loss of life haunted the Dicks for the rest of their lives. They were the only survivors from Calgary and were somewhat ostracized, both socially and in business. The Dick block was lost and had to be turned over to the city for non-payment of taxes in 1914. In 1913, the Pat Burns packing plant caught fire. This was one of the toughest and longest-lasting fires in Calgary history, taking over 1 week to put out. In 1914, the first wave of men leaving for France and the Great War left from the Grand Trunk Railroad yards.
Those were heart-rending scenes of wives, children, and sweethearts crying, still clinging to the hands of the men leaning out of the carriage windows as slowly the train moved away, many never to be seen again.
The years 1917 to 1919 saw a deadly flu epidemic spread throughout the entire city of Calgary, including the Inglewood area. It was this epidemic and its results that hastened the slide of the Inglewood community from a middle-class working suburb of a larger city into a distressed, run-down area. In the 1930s, along the Bow and Elbow rivers was thick brush and trees. A hobo jungle near the meeting of the two rivers was where the homeless would set up camp during the summer. By 1935, the Inglewood area was not particularly a pretty sight. The Calgary Herald newspaper gave a vivid picture.
Tall factory chimneys belching their smoke into the Alberta sunshine, the clang of shunting trains from a nearby divisional railroad yard, shrill whistles, the odors of an oil refinery floating up the river valley on an eastern breeze.
During this time, the second of two incidences linking the community of Inglewood with incredible historical events took place in March of 1944. 53 men escaped from Stalag Luft III prisoner of war camp in Poland during World War II in what would become known as the Great Escape. One of those men was Hank Birkeland, who lived here in this small house in the neighborhood of Ramsey, next to Inglewood and just down the road from the Deane house. Hank grew up in this area in the 1930s and in 1939 went off to war. He was instrumental in digging the tunnel that allowed the Allied prisoners to escape. However, his luck ran out when he only made it as far as Germany before being picked up by the Gestapo and summarily executed. Hank's body was never positively identified, but the designation of his gravesite in Poland has been officially sanctioned by the Government of Canada. Such was the power of the entity in the Deane house, reaching halfway around the world to affect the life of one of its neighborhood's residents. The area, as beautiful as the historical Inglewood Bird Sanctuary, is not immune from the forces of the entity. In February of 1926, the first instances of massive amounts of dead ducks and birds littering the area were reported. No satisfactory explanation for the deaths were found. In March of 1957, 21 ducks and birds were found dead on the site. The cold winter and carnivorous magpies were blamed for the massacre, but the actual cause of the incident remains a mystery. In February of 1988, dozens of ducks and fish were cryptically killed on the same grounds. Cause unknown. Eerily, 31 years separate each incident of unexplained slaughter. Paranormal investigators are waiting for the year 2019 and will be at the bird sanctuary to capture whatever is causing the deaths and possible proof of the manifestation in the Deane house at work. The most horrifying aspect of the presence in the Deane house over the years has been that of possession. There is verifiable proof that several gruesome murders that have taken place in the Inglewood area were the result of an individual being possessed by some force they could not control. To add to this, the ghosts of the murderers and their victims still roam the areas where they were killed. In 1946, 6-year-old Donnie Goss was murdered at St. George's Island Park, now the Calgary Zoo. The man who beat and knifed the child to death was Donald Sherman Staley, and it is this man who would be the first to utter the words that would describe the Inglewood murderers.
I am guilty, but I'm not responsible for my actions.
When caught, Staley admitted to having the urge to kill, and that I don't know where this urge came from. Ultimately, he was given a psychiatric examination. His insanity defense was rejected on December 5, 1946. He was hanged for his horrendous crime. Occasionally, the ghost of Donnie Goss is seen running around the area close to the south gates of the Calgary Zoo. This was the place where he was playing hide-and-seek with his brother and a friend before he was taken and killed. More shockingly, the sounds of children playing have been heard, followed by the single scream of one of them, then deadly silence. On the easterly edge of Inglewood, leading out of the community and across the Bow River, sits an empty field. In 1949, this area was home to the Inglewood Auto Trailer Court. Many people coming through Calgary on their way to other destinations would often stop here for a few nights. Such was the case with 29-year-old Donald Henderson and his 24-year-old fiancée, Yvonne Levesque. After getting into an argument on the night of August 11th, Henderson beat Levesque and in a fit of uncontrollable rage, killed her. He called for help and tried to revive her after he came to his senses, but when the police arrived and he realized that she was dead, he slipped from them and escaped. He went into the history books as Canada's most wanted fugitive. It would be another 5 years of hunting throughout Canada, the British Isles, Europe, and finally the United States of America before he was captured in California and brought back to Calgary. The motive for the murder was as old as time itself: jealousy. Henderson was envious of the affections Yvonne displayed towards her male friends and thought she might have had another boyfriend. In a series of letters to his parents while on the run, Henderson described what he felt during and after the murder.
I've seen weird faces and figures and events by which only the most intense concentration of willpower I was able to overcome. I went into a violent delirium and ravaged her. It was like coming out of a nightmare. By being sick, I've destroyed everything I've worked for.
In the end, Henderson claimed no responsibility for the murder of Yvonne Levesque. Like Donald Staley before him, he was of the opinion that I am guilty, but I am not responsible for my actions. Something had come over him, something he couldn't control. Ultimately, he was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 14 years in prison. One night in 1979, a man and a woman were walking a path near the Levesque murder site when they saw the naked figure of another woman coming out from behind a tree. She was battered and bruised. Thinking the woman was in trouble, the two called to her. Getting no reply, they cautiously walked towards her. The woman stopped, turned her head, and looked at the couple. The two stated that she had the most evil eyes we had ever seen. Terrified, they ran off. When the man glanced back, the woman was gone. There have been many instances of individuals seeing the ghost of Yvonne Levesque. Most of the stories are the same. A sad, lonely woman, naked, heavily bruised, demon eyes, forever condemned to wander a dead piece of land, alone. One of the strangest and most senseless deaths to take place in Inglewood was caused by a one-handed man who killed a one-armed man. It happened here on the banks of the Elbow River by the 9th Avenue entrance to the community. In 1956, this was a section of land known as the Jungle, a heavily forested area where transients would often come to get drunk and sleep. On August 10th,
Harry and William O'Keefe reported finding William Herbert Orlando O'More of the Oxford Rooms barely alive with his head battered about. He later admitted to killing him.
having been drinking beer, wine, and rubbing alcohol together in the jungle the night before, O'Keefe was overcome with what he later described as an unhealthy anger and viciously attacked O'More. Like Donald Henderson, O'Keefe was convicted of manslaughter. Although he admitted to the killing, he struck the same defense as Henderson and Donald Staley. I am guilty, but I am not responsible for my actions. Before he was incarcerated for 10 years, O'Keefe was asked about the unhealthy anger he felt on the night of the killing. Was it just the alcohol causing this? O'Keefe was adamant that I had felt anger before, but nothing like this. It was as if something was forcing me to do it. The ghost of William O'More has been seen sitting near the Elbow River, his face, like Yvonne Levesque's, beaten and bloodied. He stares intently across the river at the source of his misery, the Deane house, and the entity within it that keeps him prisoner on the riverbank. The most horrific of all the deaths attributed to an influence from the presence in the Deane house happened in the basement of the building itself. In 1971, Roderick Umperville, a paranoid, abusive husband, stabbed his wife, Irma, in a fit of rage and killed her. Realizing what he had done, he turned the knife on himself and committed suicide. The next morning, their two children, having slept through the tragedy of the night before, found the two bodies and hurriedly alerted the authorities. The mysterious thing about the Umperville murder was the lack of any sound. According to autopsy reports, Irma put up a fight before she succumbed to her wounds. In this situation, she would have screamed for help. Roderick would then have instinctively tried to cover her mouth. There is absolutely no doubt that she did scream, but not a word was heard by anyone in the other rooms in the basement, and the children slept through the whole incident. What kind of supernatural force stifled Irma's screams for help, and in doing so allowed her to die? Roderick Umperville knows, because the same force keeps him enslaved in the area where he committed his horrendous crime. Before the 1991 exorcism of the Deane house, there were reports of screams from the basement, but nobody could pinpoint where they were coming from or who was making them. Since then, the screams have ceased, but an angry spirit is sometimes seen roaming the area. It would appear Irma has passed on, but Roderick will forever be paying for his crime by being trapped by the entity in the house. The last of the murders influenced by the presence in the Deane house took place here, close to a hill overlooking a section of Inglewood. Although not in Inglewood itself, the incident took place in the nearby community of Ramsey. What started out as a routine disturbance call on Friday, December 20th, 1974, turned into a vicious firefight between deranged gunman Philip Laurier Gagnon and the City of Calgary Police Department in and around a converted garage. This incident has become known as Black Friday. Gagnon held the police off for 2 hours, the battle ending up between one man and 150 policemen. At one point, the armed forces were called in and an armored personnel carrier destroyed the garage. During the gunfight, 8 police officers were injured and one, Detective Boyd Davidson, was killed. Gagnon was eventually dispatched with a hail of bullets when he tried to escape out the back of the garage. Like the Cross House, the phenomenon in the Deane house is cryptically connected to the Gagnon shootout. The shootout itself took place just around the corner from the house Hank Birkeland of the Great Escape fame grew up in. Detective Boyd Davidson was the same police officer who investigated the Umperville murder-suicide. The train tracks just down from the site were, at the time, the most deadly rail crossing in the province of Alberta and situated across from the Deane house. Described as crazed, Gagnon himself displayed many of the traits attributed to the other Inglewood murderers. He seemed possessed to do what he felt he had to do, and in the end was consumed by it. There have been reports of ghostly sounds coming from the Gagnon firefight site throughout the years since the battle. People walking by the area at night and during the day have reported hearing people screaming and the firing of guns and rifles. On a cold afternoon in 1984, a woman was walking down the alley where the firefight took place and was startled when she saw a bloodied man in old clothes standing beside a garage. The man had a crazed look in his eyes and was staring intently at something on the ground. The woman, only a few feet away from the man, stopped abruptly. Slowly, the man looked up at her. She was terrified and ran off. Over the years, the same scene would be repeated. The sound of phantom gunfire and the sighting of a young man in dirty, bloodied clothes staring at something on the very spot Philip Gagnon met his end. Presently, the entity in the Deane house that has gone on such a violent, murderous rampage throughout most of its existence has seemed to have quieted down. Occupying the house while it was shunted about twice and while it was shut up during the Gaspé Lodge years caused it to become wild and uncontrollable. The police shootout in Ramsey in 1974 near the house was the last recorded instance of it influencing events in the Inglewood area. Although no one has been able to find a specific reason as to why it has not caused any further pain or suffering, 2 recent events that have shaped the destiny of the house may shed some light on the mystery. During the Gaspé Lodge years, the exterior of the Deane house was changed. The west section of the veranda was torn down, and the south section was enclosed in order to make space for rooms. In 1975, the west and south sections of the veranda were restored. It was during these restorations that eerie reports from the reconstructionists of a euphoric sensation emanating from the building were felt. In 1991, an exorcism was performed to rid the house of ghostly pests. All but a few of the spirits remain. After being shut in for so long and growing angry, the presence in the house has settled into a pleasantly restful state and quit its destructive ways. But for how long? Ultimately, we have to ask ourselves the question, why? Why do stories of the Deane house vortex persist? Does this entity exist at all? Or are all the strange and bizarre events that have taken place in Inglewood just coincidence? If we lived in a perfect world, there would be an answer to every mysterious incident or strange phenomenon we are forced to confront. It would be comforting to think that the facts surrounding the murders, suicides, ghosts, and connections to monstrous historic events in Inglewood have been distorted in order to promote a myth that is used to entertain or reinforce paranormal stereotypes such as Roderick Umperville and the lost soul seeking salvation, or Yvonne Levesque and the individual not knowing he or she is dead because of a sudden, violent death. It would also be too easy to simply say that the stories engender a distinct climate for the neighborhood that will bring out the tourists. Of course, we don't live in a perfect world, and that is why there are no answers to what is in the Deane house. All we can do is watch and study it, hoping that one day we may understand it.